In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something break. What broke was a clay jar holding scrolls that had been sealed for close to 2,000 years. Among the thousands of fragments eventually pulled from those 11 caves at Qumran were the remains of 11 separate copies of a single text, written in Aramaic, hidden by a community that clearly could not stop copying it. That text was the Book of Enoch. It was not in anyone's Bible. It had not been in anyone's Bible for over 1,000 years. And yet here it was, buried with the kind of devotion usually reserved for scripture the community considered essential to their survival. To understand why that discovery mattered, you have to understand what had already happened to this book centuries earlier. The Book of Enoch, known to scholars as First Enoch, is not a single work by a single author. It is a collection of Jewish apocalyptic writings assembled over roughly 2 centuries, from around 300 BCE up to the turn of the era, attributed to Enoch, the shadowy figure from Genesis, who is said to have walked with God and then simply vanished, taken rather than dying. The book expands that vanishing into an entire cosmology. It describes Enoch touring the heavens, the ends of the earth, the storehouses of the stars, and most strikingly, the architecture of the afterlife itself, long before Dante or any Christian concept of purgatory existed to compete with it. The book was not obscure in its own time. It was influential enough that a New Testament author quoted it directly. The Epistle of Jude, 4 short chapters near the end of the New Testament, cites Enoch by name and reproduces a prophecy from it almost word for word, introducing it with language that early readers would have recognized as the way you introduce a prophet, not a folktale. Early church writers, such as Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, treated the book with real respect, and some considered it inspired scripture in its own right. For a while, it looked like Enoch might make it into the Christian canon alongside the book that had quoted it. It did not. As the canon of Scripture solidified through the 3rd and 4th centuries, church leaders applied standards of apostolic origin, doctrinal consistency, and widespread liturgical use across many churches. And Enoch failed those tests in the eyes of the majority. Its elaborate angelology, its account of fallen angels called watchers, who mated with human women and fathered a race of giants, and its unusual view of cosmic order did not sit comfortably alongside the rest of the emerging biblical framework. By the time the canon was effectively closed in most of the Christian world, Enoch had been quietly left outside it. Jude survived the process because the early church distinguished quoting a text from canonizing it, the same way Paul could quote a Greek poet in Acts without canonizing Greek philosophy. Enoch received no such exemption. What makes this exclusion strange is that it was not universal. One church never let go of it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved the Book of Enoch as scripture in full in the ancient liturgical language of Ge'ez continuously, for as long as the rest of Christianity had forgotten it existed in complete form. While European Christians knew Enoch only through scattered quotations in the Church Fathers and the brief citation in Jude, Ethiopian monks kept copying the entire text, generation after generation, treating it as an unbroken part of their biblical canon. It survived not because it was hidden away in some conspiracy of silence, but because one community never stopped believing it belonged in Scripture in the first place. The rest of the world did not know this until the 18th century. In 1773, the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying complete Ge'ez manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, the first the West had seen of the full text in well over 1,000 years. It took another century for proper scholarly translations to appear, culminating in the work of Robert Henry Charles at the turn of the 20th century, whose English edition became the standard reference for decades. But even then, Enoch remained a curiosity, a text scholars of ancient Judaism studied, not something with independent manuscript evidence from the period when it was actually written. That changed completely in 1947. The caves at Qumran did more than confirm that the Book of Enoch existed in antiquity. They confirmed how seriously at least one Jewish community took it. Cave 4 alone yielded fragments from 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch, a number that puts it in league with the most frequently copied texts found at the site. These fragments were painstakingly assembled and published by the Polish scholar Joseph Milik in 1976, in a volume that remains foundational to the field. They cover roughly a fifth of the full Ethiopic text and represent the oldest surviving witnesses to Enoch's original language, some dating back to around 200 to 100 BCE, meaning these copies were made centuries before the New Testament was written and long before any debate about Christian canon existed. Interestingly, the fragments found at Qumran do not include the section of Enoch known as the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, the part most associated with the enigmatic Son of Man figure that echoes through the Gospels. Its absence at Qumran has led scholars to conclude that this section likely developed later, or within a different community than the one that assembled the scrolls, a reminder that Enoch itself is not one uniform composition, but a layered library that grew over time. So why did this community bury 11 copies of a book that never made it into the Bible, most of us know? The calendar is one answer. Enoch contains a detailed solar calendar system that closely matches the calendar apparently used by the Qumran community, suggesting the text shaped how they organized their religious year. But the deeper answer is theological, and it has to do with what this book claims to reveal about death, judgment, and where you go when you die, a subject the Hebrew Bible treats with almost total silence. This is the part of Enoch that actually deserves the word forbidden, not because it was suppressed in some secret plot, but because it fills a gap the rest of the Bible leaves conspicuously empty. Ask what happens after death according to the Hebrew scriptures, and the honest answer is almost nothing is said. The dead go down to Sheol, a shadowy, undifferentiated pit where the righteous and the wicked share the same fate, described in the Psalms and elsewhere as a place of silence and forgetting, not reward or punishment. There is no judgment scene. There is no separation of the good from the bad. Death is simply the end of participation in life, for everyone, regardless of how they lived. The Book of Enoch broke that silence, and it did so with startling architectural precision. In chapter 22, part of the oldest section of Enoch known as the Book of the Watchers, Enoch is taken on a guided tour by the angel Raphael to a great mountain of hard rock in the west. Inside it, he finds not one holding place for the dead, but four, each hollow, smooth, and deep. One contains a bright spring of water. The other three are dark. Enoch asks why there needs to be four separate compartments if they are all just waiting rooms for the same eventual judgment. And Raphael's answer is the moment this text quietly reshapes the entire concept of the afterlife. The four chambers exist because the dead are not equal, and their experience of waiting is not the same. The chamber with the spring of water is reserved for the righteous, who wait there in a kind of comfort, refreshed rather than tormented, anticipating vindication. A second chamber holds sinners who were never punished for their wrongdoing during their lifetime, and here they remain in pain, waiting for the judgment that never caught up with them while they were alive. A third chamber is described for those who were murdered, wrongly killed, their spirits actively crying out, making legal suit. In the text's own words, pleading their case toward heaven until justice is finally served on their behalf. A fourth chamber holds sinners who were already punished in life, whose account, in a sense, has already been partially settled, and who will not be raised together with the others on the day of final judgment. This is not vague poetic imagery. It is a structured system with rules, categories, and conditions, the earliest known Jewish text to describe an afterlife with distinct compartments assigned according to moral conduct and manner of death, rather than a single shared fate for everyone. Scholars studying the history of the concept of hell point to this exact chapter as the hinge point where the biblical idea of a flat, undifferentiated Sheol first bends towards something resembling post-mortem judgment. The conceptual ancestor of later Jewish and Christian ideas about heaven, hell, and purgatory, it is worth pausing on how radical this would have sounded to someone raised on the Hebrew Bible alone. The Torah and the Psalms give you almost nothing to hold on to about personal fate after death. Enoch hands you an actual map, chambers you could almost picture, with rules for who goes where and why, tied directly to how a person lived and how they died. That alone explains why a community like the one at Qumran, deeply invested in questions of righteousness, punishment, and the timing of divine justice, would treasure a text like this enough to copy it 11 times over. The second major piece of Enoch's afterlife theology comes from a different, later section of the book known as the Epistle of Enoch, spanning roughly chapters 92 through 105. Where the Book of the Watchers describes the architecture of the afterlife in a single vision, the epistle takes a different tone entirely. It reads like a series of legal indictments, structured as repeated declarations of woe directed at specific categories of people. The rich, who built their wealth through oppression, those who accumulate gold and silver through violence and then trust in their possessions, those who persecute the righteous while they are alive, because they believe no one is watching and no reckoning is coming. Scholars who have studied the compositional structure of this section closely, including James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, have noted that the epistle displays some of the most deliberate cause and effect construction found anywhere in the Gnostic corpus, laying out specific sins and pairing them with specific consequences in a way that reads more like a legal code than a sermon. What the epistle promises the oppressors is not comfort. It promises that their apparent escape from justice in life is temporary, and that the timing of the final judgment does not depend on when the crime was noticed by other humans. It also addresses something the Book of the Watchers only implies: what actually becomes of the righteous, who suffered and died without ever seeing their vindication. In one of its most striking passages, chapter 102, the text acknowledges the plain, painful reality that the righteous do, in fact, die like everyone else, their bodies going down into the earth exactly as the wicked do, with no visible difference at the moment of death. The text does not pretend death itself looks different for good people. Instead, It insists that the difference lies in what comes after, in the fate of their spirits, which the text says will be preserved and eventually vindicated, rather than simply ending as though the person had never existed. This is one of the earliest clear articulations in Jewish literature of the idea that death is not the final word for the righteous, an idea that would later become central to both Rabbinic Judaism's doctrine of bodily resurrection and Christian teaching about the resurrection of the dead. This is the honest, verifiable content of what the Book of Enoch says about death and judgment. Chapters 22 and 92 through 105 do describe an afterlife with real structure, real moral accounting, and real consequences tied to how a person lived. And they do so with a level of specificity the rest of the Hebrew Bible simply does not attempt. That is not exaggeration. It is well documented across decades of academic study, most comprehensively in George Nicholsburg's Hermeneia commentary on Enoch published in 2001, and in the full critical translation Nicholsburg produced together with Vanderkam in 2004, both of which remain the standard scholarly references in English today. What the text does not do, despite what you may have seen claimed elsewhere, is single out cremation as a distinct category with its own chamber, its own dedicated verse, or its own unique fate separate from ordinary death and burial. The 4 chambers of chapter 22 are organized around whether a person was righteous or wicked, and in the case of the wicked, whether their wrongdoing was already punished in life or went unaddressed, and whether they were victims of injustice crying out for it to be corrected. Method of burial, or the absence of burial altogether, is not the organizing principle of the text. This is an important distinction because it is easy for a video, a blog post, or a paraphrase circulating online to blur the line between what an ancient text actually says and what a modern reader assumes it must be implying. The genuine content of Enoch's Afterlife chapters is remarkable enough without needing to invent a specific clause about cremation that the manuscripts themselves do not contain. Treat any claim, citing a specific verse number and a dramatic quote about the fate of the cremated with real skepticism, and if you want to check it yourself, the full Geas text was translated into English by Ephraim Isaac in 1983 for James Charlesworth's 2-volume collection of Jewish pseudepigraphal writings, a translation any serious researcher can access and read start to finish. It is worth addressing directly why a claim about cremation attaches itself to this text so easily, because the mechanism is almost more interesting than the myth itself. In 1963, the Catholic Church did lift its long-standing prohibition on cremation for its members, a real and well-documented change in church policy issued through the Vatican's Holy Office. That policy shift had nothing to do with any Enochic text. It emerged from mid-20th century pastoral and practical considerations, including public health concerns, urban land scarcity for burial, and a reassessment of whether cremation itself contradicted belief in bodily resurrection, a question theologians concluded it did not, since an omnipotent God was not considered constrained by the physical state of a body at the time of judgment. The coincidence of 2 unrelated facts, an ancient apocalyptic text with an elaborate afterlife geography and a 20th century policy change about burial practices, is exactly the kind of gap that gets filled with invented causation once a video needs a dramatic hook. The honest version of this story does not need that invention. The real history of Enoch's exclusion, preservation, and rediscovery carries its own weight. To understand why scholars take this material so seriously without needing to embellish it, it helps to look at how the surrounding mythology of the Book of the Watchers sets up the judgment scene in chapter 22 in the first place. The Watchers are described as roughly 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, bound by a mutual oath to take human wives, a direct expansion of the single cryptic verse in Genesis 6 about the sons of God and the daughters of men. Their offspring are giants, described as enormous, violent, and destructive, consuming everything around them until they turn on humanity itself. God's response, according to the text, is not only to send the flood, but to bind the watchers themselves in darkness beneath the earth until the day of judgment, a sentence separate from and prior to the fate awaiting ordinary human souls. This matters because it establishes, early in the text, that judgment in Enoch's cosmology is not a single undifferentiated event. Different classes of beings, angelic and human, righteous and wicked, victims and perpetrators, are shown receiving different treatment according to what they did and what was done to them. Chapter 22's 4 chambers are not an isolated idea bolted onto the story. They are the human-scale application of a principle the book has already spent 20 chapters establishing at the cosmic scale. The scholarly reconstruction of exactly how these chapters were composed and transmitted also deserves more attention than it usually gets in popular retellings. Michael Knibb of King's College London produced the critical edition of the Ethiopic text that remains a standard reference for comparing manuscript variants across the roughly 50 surviving Geas copies, work that allows scholars today to distinguish later scribal editions from material present in the earliest recoverable form of the text. George Nicholsburg's analysis, running to hundreds of pages in his 2001 commentary, traces how the vocabulary used to describe judgment, suffering, and vindication in the Book of the Watchers connects to similar vocabulary later reused and intensified in the Epistle of Enoch, suggesting a single evolving tradition rather than two unrelated documents stitched together by accident. Research into the Aramaic fragments themselves, drawn directly from the Qumran caves, has confirmed that the core judgment vocabulary in these sections is old, present already in the earliest Aramaic layer, not a later theological addition inserted after the text reached Ethiopia centuries afterward. None of this scholarship claims to have found a secret clause about the method of disposing of a body. What it consistently finds is a text obsessed with a single question. Does moral conduct in life determine your fate after death? And if so, exactly how is that fate organized? That is the actual mystery this book was written to solve, and it is a considerably richer subject than any single invented verse about ashes could ever be. So what makes this material genuinely significant, and why should anyone care that it sat outside the Bible for over 1,000 years? Because what Enoch actually preserves is a snapshot of a live theological argument happening inside Judaism in the centuries before Christianity existed. An argument about whether a just God can allow the wicked to prosper and the righteous to suffer without any eventual correction. The flat silence of Sheol in the older biblical tradition left that question essentially unanswered. Enoch answers it directly, with chambers, with waiting periods, with murder victims given a voice to demand justice, and with a promise that death does not erase the moral ledger. That answer mattered enormously to communities living under foreign occupation and religious persecution in the Second Temple period, which is almost certainly why a group like the one at Qumran, convinced that they alone were living righteously, while the powerful around them prospered through corruption, held onto this text with such intensity that they copied it more times than most books that did make it into the Bible. It also mattered enough that traces of this exact worldview echo forward into later texts that did make the canon. The concept of a Sheol split into distinct fates rather than a single shared destination anticipates the Gospel's own references to Hades, Gehenna, and Abraham's bosom. And Jude's direct citation of Enoch's judgment prophecy shows that at least one New Testament author treated this material as carrying real prophetic weight, not merely folklore. The line between canonical and non-canonical, in other words, was drawn later, and by committee, not because the ideas themselves were considered false, but because the specific books carrying them did not meet the institutional criteria eventually applied to the New Testament and Old Testament as we know them. Enoch's four-chambered underworld was not a completely isolated idea within Second Temple Judaism, and that context helps explain why the concept had staying power. A later apocalyptic work known as Fourth Ezra, written toward the end of the 1st century CE, describes a comparable system of distinct holding places for departed souls, souls of the righteous kept apart from the souls of the wicked, while both await final judgment, evidence that the compartmentalized afterlife Enoch first sketched had become a shared framework rather than a one-off literary invention. The Book of Jubilees, another text found in unusually high numbers among the Qumran fragments, likewise assumes an afterlife where the fate of a person's spirit is not identical for everyone. Set beside these related works, Enoch's chapter 22 looks less like an isolated curiosity and more like the earliest fully worked out example of an idea that Jewish thought was moving toward more broadly in this period. The idea that a person's spirit carries the moral weight of their life forward into whatever comes next. The specific language the Epistle of Enoch uses to describe what happens to the righteous spirit after death is also worth noting on its own terms. Chapter 102 does not dress up death as painless or instantaneous relief. It confronts the reader with the same blunt image the Psalms already offered, that the body of the righteous person goes into the ground exactly like anyone else's, with no external sign of favor. What the text adds to that old, stark picture is a claim about the interior fate of the spirit, insisting that it is preserved rather than extinguished, a claim that later Jewish and Christian writers would build entire theologies of bodily resurrection on top of. It is this connective tissue, running from Enoch through Jubilees and Fourth Ezra and eventually into the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament, that scholars find a genuinely significant, far more significant than any single sensational verse could be. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the canon that most Christians read today, but it was never actually erased from the intellectual history of that canon. Its account of angels held for judgment, its layered underworld, its insistence that moral conduct outlives the body, all of it fed directly into the theological vocabulary the New Testament authors inherited and used without needing to explain where the concepts originally came from, because their audience already knew this material from a book that was, at the time, still widely read even outside the group that eventually preserved it whole. That is a more durable kind of influence than a single suppressed verse could ever carry, and it is verifiable across 2,000 years of manuscript history rather than resting on a single quotation nobody can actually locate in any translation. None of this requires believing the Book of Enoch is literally historically accurate about the architecture of the afterlife to find it worth taking seriously. It requires only recognizing that this is a real ancient text, preserved for over 2,000 years by one continuous religious tradition, rediscovered in fragmentary form in the very caves where a community hid its most valued writings from Roman destruction. And it says something specific, structured, and historically important about how ancient Jewish thinkers were working out the problem of divine justice after death, decades before that same problem shaped the New Testament itself. The real story here was never a secret clause about ashes. It was a 2,000-year paper trail showing exactly how the idea of judgment after death was built, verse by verse, argument by argument, long before anyone called it heaven or hell. If ancient texts like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate us, subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we dig into another piece of scripture history that got left out of the story most of us were taught. And we do it the same way we did here, by going straight to the manuscripts and the scholars who have actually spent their careers studying them. Drop a comment below with which forbidden or forgotten text you want us to cover next. And if you learned something new today, share this with someone who thinks the Bible as we know it is the whole story. It never was.